Forget the rigid rules of the modern world. Strip away the noise of the century you live in and let your mind drift back to an unforgiving, ancient era where the sun scorched the earth, where blood and dust painted the soil, and where the clash of bronze was the only music that mattered. Imagine a knot, a legendary, impossibly complex tangle of thick rope housed inside a silent temple. For centuries, the most brilliant kings, the wisest philosophers, and the most cunning generals had traveled from the corners of the earth to solve this puzzle. The prophecy was absolute. The man who unties the Gordian knot will become the undisputed master of Asia. They all came. They pulled at the ropes with bleeding fingers. They exhausted their intellect. And eventually, every single one of them walked away in defeat. Then, a young man in his early 20s steps into the temple. He has golden hair and a feral, unearthly fire burning in his eyes. He looks at the knot. He does not use his fingers. He does not care about the rules, nor does he respect the failures of the wise men who came before him. He simply narrows his eyes, draws his heavy iron sword, and with one brutal, echoing strike, cleaves the centuries-old knot perfectly in half. This is not a story about following the rules. This is the saga of a man who looked at the chessboard, flipped the entire table, and set the room on fire. This is the epic of an invincible monster who wanted to swallow the horizon, who convinced himself he was a god, and who ultimately drowned in the bottomless abyss of his own ambition. Alexander the Great. Turn off the lights. Open the doors of your mind. Because when you examine this terrifying psychological map, you will not just see an ancient king. You will witness the insatiable, terrifying darkness of human nature itself. What creates a monster? Most historians romanticize Alexander, claiming he was born a conqueror, chosen by the heavens. But the truth was forged in the cold, venomous corridors of a palace. Alexander grew up fighting one of the most crippling psychological battles a son can face, surviving the colossal shadow of his father. King Philip II of Macedon was no ordinary man. He was a ruthless, brilliant tactician who took a fractured, impoverished kingdom of shepherds and transformed it into the deadliest military machine in Greece. Philip was victorious in every campaign. Every time a messenger arrived at the palace bearing news of another province conquered, another treasury looted, young Alexander would retreat to his chambers and weep. When asked why the prince was crying over a victory, his answer revealed the first spark of a terminal ambition. My father is going to conquer everything. He will leave nothing for me. On one side was a towering, omnipotent father. On the other was his mother, Olympias, a fiercely ambitious, dangerous woman deeply involved in dark mysticism, who constantly whispered into her son's ear, "You are not Philip's son. You are the son of Zeus. You were born to rule the earth." Between these two crushing forces, Alexander's mind was hammered into an unbreakable iron blade. Then came the fracture. In 336 BC, at a royal wedding, a dagger flashed through the crowd and buried itself in King Philip's chest. The king was dead. History has never definitively proven who orchestrated the assassination, but the dark, lingering suspicion that Alexander and his mother guided the assassin's hand remains etched in the annals of time. Alexander was only 20 years old. He ascended the throne before his father's blood had even dried on the marble. There was no time for mourning. There was only time for the purge. With chilling, emotionless precision, Alexander executed every potential rival, every distant relative, and even his infant half-brothers. Power abhors a vacuum, and Alexander knew the only way to fill it was with blood. Macedon was his, but that was not enough. Greece bowed to him. Not enough. He wanted his father's ultimate dream. He wanted the Persian Empire. He wanted the known world. Spring, 334 BC. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with 40,000 men, he did not have the treasury to fund a continental war. His army had provisions for barely 30 days. The Macedonian coffers were utterly empty. A logical, measured general would never launch a campaign under such suicidal conditions. But Alexander was not a logical general. He was a fearless gambler pushing his absolute last chip onto red. Waiting for him was the largest, wealthiest, and most terrifying superpower humanity had ever seen, the Persian Empire. King Darius III ruled over millions of soldiers, mountains of gold, and endless territories. Alexander's army was a mere drop in the Persian Ocean. The first major clash occurred at the Granicus River. The Persian forces were heavily entrenched on the steep opposite bank, waiting for the Greeks to cross. Parmenion, Alexander's oldest and most experienced general, advised caution. "Let us wait," he urged. "We will cross at dawn. If we attack now, the river will swallow us." Sitting atop his massive black stallion, Bucephalus, Alexander stared at the enemy lines. Words like wait, defend, or retreat simply did not exist in his vocabulary. He issued an order bordering on sheer madness. Without even forming proper battle lines, the Macedonians charged directly into the rushing river, aiming straight for the strongest point of the Persian center. It was tactical suicide. The initial clash was chaotic. Alexander's helmet was cleaved in two by a Persian battle axe, and he was seconds away from death. Yet, that feral, rule-breaking audacity shattered the Persian strategy. The first victory was secured. But the true psychological masterclass took place at Issus. Infuriated by the arrogant Greek boy, King Darius personally descended upon the battlefield with a monstrously large army. The numbers were paralyzing. When the Macedonian soldiers looked at the horizon, they could not see where the enemy lines ended. As the battle commenced, Alexander's genius revealed itself. He was not a king who commanded from a luxurious tent in the rear. He fought at the very tip of the spear, leading his elite companion cavalry in a devastating wedge formation. His target was not the enemy army. His eyes were locked on a singular point: the golden chariot of King Darius. Darius was surrounded by his elite bodyguards, the Immortals. Ignoring the chaos, the slaughter, and the sheer impossibility of the maneuver, Alexander drove his cavalry like a guided missile straight into the heart of the Persian command. He came with such ferocity, such unstoppably violent intent, that when Darius locked eyes with the blood-soaked, crazed young king tearing through his guards, a profound, icy terror gripped his soul. The most powerful emperor on earth suffered a catastrophic psychological collapse. While the battle was still raging, while his army still heavily outnumbered the Greeks, Darius turned his chariot and fled the battlefield in sheer panic. Witnessing their god-king run away, the colossal Persian army disintegrated in seconds. Alexander had won not just with steel, but through the contagious, destructive power of fear. The gates of Asia were now blown wide open. If you wish to test the absolute limits of a man's willpower, tell him something is impossible. Marching south toward Egypt, Alexander encountered Tyre, the wealthiest and most heavily fortified merchant city in the ancient world. Tyre was an island fortress, surrounded by massive walls, sitting half a mile offshore in deep water. Conquering it without a massive navy was a physical impossibility. The Tyrian ambassadors rode out to Alexander, laughing in his face. "We will offer you gold, but you shall never set foot inside our city." A nerve twitched in Alexander's jaw. The word never awoke the beast chained inside the dark rooms of his mind. He lost all sense of rationality. He was going to take that island. How? By destroying the sea. He issued an order that defied the laws of nature. "We will build a land bridge. We will walk to the island." His engineers were stunned. To build a solid causeway of stone, timber, and earth across half a mile of deep ocean currents was an architectural nightmare that would take months of grueling labor. But Alexander's will was harder than the bedrock of the earth. His soldiers tore down forests, demolished ancient ruins, and threw mountains of stone into the sea. At first, the Tyrians stood on their walls and mocked the Macedonians. But as the causeway crept closer and closer, inch by bloody inch, their laughter curdled into dread. The Tyrians sent burning fire ships to destroy the bridge. They rained arrows down on the laborers. They executed Greek prisoners on the walls. Alexander did not blink. He rebuilt the bridge wider. He built it stronger. For 7 agonizing, mud-soaked, blood-drenched months, the nightmare continued. During the darkest days of the siege, a letter arrived from the fugitive King Darius. It read, "You have captured my family. Return them, and let us end this war. I will give you all my territories west of the Euphrates River, and 10,000 talents of gold." It was an offer of unimaginable wealth and power, an offer any sane king would accept on his knees. Alexander read the letter to his generals. Parmenion sighed deeply and said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept this immediately." Alexander turned slowly. His eyes possessed a cold, arrogant, divine gleam. "If I were Parmenion," he whispered, "I would accept it too, but I am Alexander." When the land bridge finally touched the walls of Tyre, Alexander's wrath descended upon the city like a biblical plague. He was so enraged by their defiance that he slaughtered 8,000 citizens, sold 30,000 into slavery, and crucified 2,000 men along the shores of the very beach he had built. This was no longer warfare. This was the wrath of a mortal who demanded to be recognized as a god. Egypt surrendered without a single drop of blood spilled. They crowned him pharaoh, welcoming him as a savior. But for Alexander, Egypt was not just strategic territory. He was searching for an answer buried deep within the scorching, lethal sands of the Sahara at the oasis of Siwa. Taking only a small escort, he marched into the unforgiving desert. After weeks of sandstorms, dehydration, and hallucinations, they reached the temple of Amun. As the high priest stepped out of the shadows to welcome the conqueror, he attempted to greet him in Greek. Whether his tongue slipped or he meant it deliberately, instead of saying, "O Paidion, my son," he said, "O Paidios, son of God." This was the absolute fracture, the moment the human mind cracked. Until that day, Alexander had used the myth of his divine parentage as a brilliant piece of political propaganda to terrify his enemies and motivate his troops. But after entering that dark, silent sanctuary alone and emerging hours later, the man had changed. He had started believing his own lie. He was no longer the son of Philip of Macedon. He was the son of Zeus Amun. When you tell a man you can do anything, you are invincible, you are a deity, and he actually internalizes it, you plant the seeds of an apocalypse. Alexander injected this venom directly into his veins. He began demanding that his freeborn Greek generals bow before him, pressing their faces into the dirt in the Persian ritual of proskynesis. His veterans, the men who had bled beside him and slept in the mud with him, were disgusted. "Where is the young king who shared our rations?" they whispered. Alexander had started wearing Persian robes, adopting the despotic rituals of the East. He was no longer the shield of Greece. He had mutated into the very darkness he had sworn to destroy. Believing his own myth made him deeply, lethally paranoid. Suspecting an unproven assassination plot, he mercilessly executed his closest friends, his elite cavalry commanders, and even the loyal aged Parmenion and his son. The system had begun to rot. The sword was now cutting inward. But before the final collapse, there was one last hand to be played on the grand table. 331 BC, the plains of Gaugamela. King Darius had left nothing to chance this time. He amassed a gargantuan army of over 250,000 men. To ensure his scythe chariots could slice through the Greek infantry, Darius spent days flattening the battlefield, removing every rock and smoothing the terrain like a billiard table. Darius had chosen the time, the place, and the rules of engagement. Alexander's forces numbered a mere 47,000. The odds were so overwhelmingly grim that Parmenion visited Alexander's tent at midnight, begging him to launch a sneak attack under the cover of darkness. Alexander smiled. "I do not steal my victories," he replied. That night, with 250,000 executioners waiting just a few miles away, do you know what Alexander did? He went to sleep. He slept so deeply, so peacefully, that his generals had to forcefully shake him awake as the sun rose. This was not mere bravery. This was the ultimate manifestation of his divine hubris. It was the absolute conviction of a man who believed the universe had already written his victory. When the battle began, Darius unleashed his scythed chariots. The highly disciplined Macedonians didn't panic. They simply opened their ranks, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through empty space, and slaughtered the drivers from behind. Then, Alexander executed the most daring, high-risk tactical maneuver in military history. He began drifting his entire right wing outward, away from the battlefield. Darius, terrified of being outflanked, stretched his own left wing to mirror the movement. That was the lethal microsecond Alexander had been waiting for. As the Persian line stretched, a tiny, momentary gap tore open in their center. Instantly, Alexander snapped his cavalry back into a wedge, reversed direction, and drove like a thunderbolt straight through that microscopic crack, directly at Darius. Once again, amidst the choking dust of Gaugamela, the emperor of the world locked eyes with the feral Macedonian. Once again, Darius's nerves shattered. He abandoned his army and fled. The victory at Gaugamela made Alexander the absolute master of the known world. The unimaginable riches of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fell at his feet. At the climax of a drunken, delirious celebration, Alexander took a torch and personally burned the magnificent palace of Persepolis to the ground. Whether it was a calculated act of revenge for Athens or the reckless vandalism of a bored god, history will never truly know. If a man's goal is to conquer a specific territory, he stops when he plants his flag. But if a man's goal is to feed a bottomless, starving beast inside his chest, he will devour the entire planet and still feel empty. Alexander had obliterated the Persian Empire. He could have stopped. He could have ruled the greatest state in history and lived in boundless luxury. But he was obsessed with finding the physical edge of the map. He dragged his exhausted, battered army into the unknown nightmares of India. Years passed. The soldiers grew old. Their armor rusted in the relentless, rotting monsoon rains. Exotic diseases ate their flesh. They faced Indian kings mounted on armored war elephants. On the banks of the Hydaspes River, men were trampled and crushed into the mud, realizing they were no longer conquering heroes. They were merely disposable cogs in a madman's machine. Finally, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, the inevitable fracture occurred. When Alexander ordered the army to march further east, the men did not move. Tens of thousands of the deadliest soldiers on earth dropped their shields, drove their swords into the earth, and sat down in the mud. They didn't riot. They didn't scream. They simply stared at him in deafening silence. The god king who had shattered empires, flattened mountains, and erased oceans stood completely paralyzed by the simple word "no" from his own men. Coenus, one of his most loyal commanders, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. "My king, look at us. We have left our youth on these roads. We miss our families. We miss our homes. It is enough. Please, it is enough." Enough. The concept was utterly alien to Alexander. The horizon was right there. How could he stop? He retreated to his tent. For 3 days, mirroring his mythological hero Achilles, he wept, threw violent tantrums, and refused to eat. The heavens had granted him the power to conquer the globe, but they had stripped him of the ability to conquer the hearts of his own men. Defeated, he finally ordered the retreat. On that muddy riverbank, Alexander did not just stop marching, he started dying. Like a shark that stops swimming forward, he began to suffocate. The journey back was an act of petty, vindictive cruelty. Driven by spite, he marched his army through the lethal Gedrosian desert, losing more than half of his men to dehydration and heat exhaustion without fighting a single battle. It was the revenge of a thwarted god against the mortals who had denied him. When he returned to Babylon, Alexander was no longer the energetic, visionary youth of 20. He was 32, but his soul resembled a 1,000-year-old ruin. His body was a map of brutal scars, pierced by countless arrows and swords. Pushed far beyond human endurance, his physical vessel was failing. His mind was a labyrinth of paranoia. He descended into severe alcoholism, drowning his fractured psyche in days-long drinking binges. When Hephaestion, his closest companion, his shadow, his soulmate, suddenly fell ill and died, the final load-bearing pillar in Alexander's mind snapped. He crucified Hephaestion's physician, clung to the rotting corpse for days, ordered the manes of all horses to be shorn, and demanded that the entire empire plunge into absolute agonizing mourning. There was no world left to conquer. Restless and decaying, he planned a new campaign to subjugate Arabia. But just days before the departure, on a sweltering June evening in 323 BC inside the colossal palace of Babylon, he collapsed with a sudden, violent fever. The invincible body was bedridden. The fever did not break. His superhuman will was being systematically dismantled by a microscopic pathogen, malaria, or perhaps poison. He lost his voice. He became paralyzed. When his veterans heard that their god was dying, they wept openly, forcing their way into the palace. In absolute silence, thousands of battle-hardened men filed past his bed to pay their final respects. Alexander could only acknowledge them with the slight movement of his eyes. In his final, agonizing moments, his generals leaned in and asked him the question that would drench the world in blood. "To whom do you leave the empire?" There was no clear heir. There was no established system of succession. With his cracked, trembling lips, Alexander whispered, the most selfish, chaotic, and ruthless last will in human history, "To the strongest." It was not a testament. It was a declaration of absolute war. The second he drew his last breath, the monumental empire he had built shattered into jagged pieces. For 40 excruciating years, his generals tore each other apart in the brutal wars of the Diadochi. His mother, his wives, and his infant son were all ruthlessly assassinated by the very commanders who once bowed to him. Of the world he bled to build, nothing remained but fractured borders on a map and a few dozen cities bearing his name. When you absorb this saga, it is incredibly easy to be mesmerized by Alexander's brilliance and his fearless audacity. But we are not here to recite romantic poetry. We are here to decode the mechanics of the system. The cold, unforgiving strategic lesson hidden in this epic is this: a man who does not know where to stop is simply accelerating toward his own cliff. Alexander the Great was the most flawless tactician to ever walk a battlefield. He knew exactly how to win the game, but he never, ever learned how to walk away from the table. If in your business, your investments, your relationships, or your ambitions, you do not possess an exit strategy, a defined point where you look at the board and say, "This is enough," you are not building an empire. You are meticulously engineering a very slow, very spectacular suicide. Alexander conquered the physical world, but he fundamentally failed to conquer his own ambition. If a man tries to drink the entire ocean, he will inevitably drown. The psychological disease of more, the toxic dopamine addiction to endless success, will eventually blind your intellect. It will turn you from a brilliant visionary into a crying, desperate child sitting in the mud of an Indian river, abandoned by the people who built you. The story of Alexander is not a template for success. It is a laboratory recording of how intellect, courage, and vision are completely pulverized by an unchecked ego. The colossal structure he built evaporated the moment his heart stopped. Why? Because he built the entire system exclusively upon himself. When the architect died, the foundation collapsed. If you are rising, if you are achieving greatness, ask yourself the one question Alexander never could: what will I do when I reach the horizon? Because if you do not know how to stop when the map ends, your ambition will not. And when there is nothing left outside to consume, that ambition will turn inward and begin devouring you alive. Just like it did to a 32-year-old boy, rotting in a dark, sweaty room in Babylon, genuinely believing he was a god. The ledger is closed.